Thanks, Rick. And good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. We were joking about half an hour ago about whether or not we would go over or under 60 for this final session. And I took the under, and I was wrong. Looks like we're well over 60. So it's great to see so many of you hanging with us to the very end of the conference, in spite of it being near the end of the day and an impending winter storm. We have some great information to share with you this afternoon. And if you look in your app, you'll notice that we are actually missing our third speaker. We had hoped to be joined today by the Chief Judge of the DC Court of Appeals, Anna Blackburn-Rigsby. Unfortunately, she came down sick, and so she sends her regrets. She's had a really significant imprint on the work that we've been doing at NCSC with CCJ and with COSCA as we try to develop programs and strategies that will effectively increase public trust in the courts. So she sends her very best wishes to each and every one of you. You've already met the two of us, and so we're going to get into the substance of what we want to talk about this afternoon. You have on your tables a copy of a handbook. It's in the materials electronically, but you also have a paper copy, and encourage you to take that home with you. And if you find this information interesting, please take extra copies. They are scattered on tables throughout the room. We've got lots, so if there are folks in your courts back home that you think might be interested in having a paper copy, please help yourself. So Carl and I are going to kind of talk through this session. And we'd like to engage you as well. Because we're live streaming, of course, we want to make sure that if you have questions that you get up to a microphone. And we absolutely encourage you to do that as we go. You don't have to feel like you need to wait to the end. If there's something that you want to know, you can come up to a mic or just raise your hand and we'll get one run over to you. So I'm going to begin with a quick overview of what we're here to talk about, which is new message and communications research around increasing public trust in the courts. And as you can tell, the session and this handbook you have in front of you is called Beyond Civics Education. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of where we stand with the public and whether or not civics education is getting us to where we need to be and what we might do differently. One of the first observations that I'll have for you is a lot of what you're going to hear about today has been gleaned through years of public opinion research that Carl's firm, GBAO Strategies, has done on behalf of the National Center. And we took all that information and we sort of put it together, and we realized that while we had a lot of data, a lot of the what part of the problem, we didn't necessarily have answers to the why. Why do people feel the way that they do about the courts when they're disaffected, when they're frustrated? We can point to numbers, but we couldn't necessarily explain why. And so in 2023, we decided to sort of expand the project to include some focus groups. And I'll talk about those in a second and have Carl elaborate on how those work. But one of the things that the focus group, I think, immediately opened our eyes to is the fact that there is a pretty big divide or gap in how we see the work that we do every day inside the courts and how people on the outside see that work. And so that's really what this effort is designed to address. How do we close that gap? Civics education is very important as a part of this work. And I want to be very clear about that. I think we say that in the guidebook. This is not meant to suggest that civics is not important. It really very much is. And our organization does a ton of work in this area. We have one of our signature awards is the Sandra Day O'Connor Award for Excellence in Civics Education, and we give that out every year. So we are fully committed to promoting civics as a means to help people understand our system of government and the courts in particular. But we feel like at this point, we have to go a little bit beyond just civics education. We're living in an era of a very hyper-politicized public discourse where everything in the public domain is seen through a partisan lens. And that makes it very hard to talk to people about the nonpartisan work that we do as court professionals. Here's an example. We're going to provide some quotes as we go throughout this presentation of information that was shared with us, things that we pulled out from our focus groups that we thought were particularly interesting. And this is the sort of thing that we heard a lot about in these conversations. It's that everything about the government today feels like it's politicized. And so this quote is a great example of even for people who feel like the courts are doing work the right way, maybe they're reaching the decisions that people are happy to support, they still see the politics in it. It's tough. So the purpose of the research that we did, as I said, was to get to the why. Why do you feel the way that you do, and what are we able to do about that? Here's a look at the focus groups, as well as the dates that we did them and the cities that we did them in. As you can see, we went across the country from Arizona to the Midwest in Chicago. We did some in Arlington, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington. And then we did some virtual focus groups on Zoom. And that allowed us to bring in voices of individuals who are not able to be in big cities. And so we focused on rural voters and getting some perceptions from them through Zoom focus groups. So let me turn to Carl, and Carl is our pollster, our research methodologist, the expert in how you conduct these sorts of conversations. And Carl, I wanted to begin with a basic question, which is, I haven't done a whole lot of focus groups. I've seen a few. I would imagine many people in this audience probably haven't been a part of one or seen one. They might have some idea about what they look like. But could you elaborate a bit on how these are structured and how they work?
Sure. So, working backwards, we've done survey work for over a decade. And the surveys are great, but you have to predetermine the answers before you ask the questions, right? People are choosing from a set list of answers. And so, as Jesse said, focus groups allow us to do the why. But we looked first at the survey data and what we had seen over years, and we saw that certain groups of people across the country have demonstrated less trust in the courts than others. Younger people show less trust in the courts than older people. Women show less trust in the courts than men. Communities of color show less trust in the courts than white people. So we then designed the focus groups to focus on the communities and the groups that had demonstrated the lowest trust in the courts so we could really understand what was driving that. And what we do when we do focus groups, a survey is great. You talk to 1,000 people, and if you do the right thing, it's statistically representative, and you can kind of project it to the larger population. Focus groups are not designed to be projectable to that at all. You get 10 people, you get them in a room, and typically we build groups that are homogeneous. So most of the groups were single gender, either all women or all men. We did in Arlington, right outside of Washington, as Jesse said, we did one group of all Black participants. In Phoenix, we did one group of all Hispanic participants. So you try to get a group of people that when they look at each other, they think they're going to understand each other. If you have, a 17-year-old to a 75-year-old, they tend to talk past each other, and it's very difficult for them to kind of, converse and when they've never met each other before, and to really, work off of each other and find common ground. So we get groups together, small groups, that are not projectable to the larger electorate, but are representative. And then we talk to a bunch of different groups, and we try to pull out common themes as well as unique themes, right? Certain themes are unique to certain groups that we don't hear in other groups, and then there are other consistent themes that we hear across all these different audiences. But it's really a conversation, the kind of conversation that you can't have in a survey, but really helps you dig down. And even, some of the messaging and some of the things that we've talked about that we tested, they read it, they say, oh, I like this one. This is the most convincing to me. Well, why? What is it? Is there a specific phrase? Is there a specific concept that really, grabs on? And so it really helps us dig a lot deeper and push back and get a lot more nuance from them that we can get in survey research.
And so you don't just start right out of the gates by sitting people down and say, I know you think about the courts every single day of your life. How does it work once you begin the conversation? How do you get them to a place where they're thinking about what we're talking about today?
So we kind of lay out the rules of the conversation, right? One person at a time, being respectful, everybody's opinion is equal, that kind of stuff. We tell them there's a camera, so they're comfortable in the room, because it's weird, right? You get 10 strangers in a room and you start asking questions. It's a little weird, so we want to make them as comfortable as possible. But we always structure the conversation from broad to specific, because once you introduce a concept, once you introduce a line of questioning, you can't pull it back, right? It's going to bias everything that comes after it. So we start very broadly talking about the communities, what's going on in your community, what are the good things, what are the bad things, what's changed recently, and we talk about that. And we talk about their communities, we talk about personal struggles they may be dealing with, whether it's economic concerns about crime in their neighborhoods, whatever it might be, whatever they tell us they're concerned of. We don't go in with a set list. It's very broad, and we let them direct the conversation as much as possible. And my job as the moderator of the focus group is to kind of steer the conversation, right? I'm not trying to introduce them. There's no right answers or wrong answers as far as I'm concerned. I just want them to be honest. So I'm trying to steer the conversation in a way that touches on the important points, but biases it as little as possible, so that we're hearing their ideas, not our ideas being parroted back to us.
So the title of the session is Beyond Civics Education, and I think probably a great place to start is to simply talk about, like, why do we need to go beyond? What's wrong with simply focusing on civics education? There's story after story about how people can't name the 3 branches of government, and they couldn't name you 2 people on the Supreme Court. There's a lot of work to do there. Why shouldn't we just follow down the path of focusing on civics? Why is that not enough?
The short answer is it's not working. And there are larger issues and larger reasons for that, having to do with the education system and a lot of other things that court leaders, as adept and talented as you all are perhaps not going to solve in your free time. So our survey research, and we've been working with the National Center for over a decade now, has shown a consistent decline, and this isn't just our research, you find this in public opinion research all over, a consistent decline in institutions across our society, whether we're talking about academic, whether we're talking about religious organizations, the corporate world, all are held in less esteem than they were. And when we started doing our work over a decade ago, there was a big gap in how people viewed the courts versus how they viewed the executive and the legislative branches, the much more partisan political branches. Over the last decade, that gap has narrowed precipitously. And there's a number of reasons for that. But the crisis, nonetheless, for the courts is that they are seen increasingly political, and public confidence has deteriorated significantly. So how do we do something about that? The reason that it has declined is that when we teach civics education, we're teaching about an ideal. We're teaching about the way things should be. Very few Americans look at government today and say, yes, that's the model, that's how it should be. So if you're teaching them about what it should be, but there's a dissonance and it doesn't reflect what they see in their daily lives, then knowing how it should be doesn't really matter that much in how they view the courts, right? So what we wanted to do, and what we're talking about here today, is teaching them more about the way things are, right? And the good things that the courts are doing and the ways that they are acting in the way that they want to. Because if the courts are just seen as another extension of government, there's a lot of negative baggage that comes with that right now in public opinion. Regardless of which side of the political aisle, everyone's got a lot of concerns about government. So if the courts are just another piece of government, there's going to be a lot of concern. And so we want to, kind of create some cognitive dissonance and say, no, it's not really what you think. What you see when you look at Congress and all the dysfunction and all that, that's not what's happening at the state level. And there's a lot of concern. We've seen a massive decline in confidence in the Supreme Court. And for a lot of people, that's the only court they hear about. And that's the only court they think about. So we want to, change that. We don't want attitudes about the state courts and the local courts to be dictated by what's happening, with 9 justices up on a hill in Washington, right? We want to bring it down much more to the local level. And that's really going beyond just, the 3 branches of government, the civics education, to tell them about what's really happening in their communities.
I guess another way to describe this is that when it comes to civics education, people aren't really buying what we're selling. So
yeah, I think that's a good way of characterizing it.
So we're going to push on here, and I think we're going to spend the next 15 or so minutes talking through some of what we heard. We want to start by sort of defining the problem. And as Carl explained, these focus groups are useful in that you can elicit fairly detailed information about how people see government, how they see a system, how they see it impacting their lives, how they see it impacting their friends and their families. And that is really what we heard a lot about. And so we're going to take a quick look here at I think one of the things that we heard most often and most loud from everybody that we talked to, which is an increasing number of people see a two-tiered system of justice. And this is a really, I think, troubling and concerning finding. I'm not sure that it's a terribly new one, but the anxiety that is being heard behind some of what we're being told, the severity of it, I think, is increasing. And so when we talk about two systems of justice, we see this in our polling. We see this in our polling through this question where we've asked people, we've asked our respondents every year since we started this survey work in 2012, whether or not courts are doing a good job of providing equal justice to all. This is, I think, maybe the core piece of information in understanding where people are right now and where they have come from over the last number of years. Equal justice for all is a core function of the courts, perhaps the core function. It's the thing that we put up over the buildings saying that we do. And so when you see people beginning to feel like we're not doing that very well, then that's a deep concern. And you can see this trend line over the last 10 years where the green line shows people saying that courts are doing it well, and the orange line shows those who say that we're not doing it well. And you can see that the advantage that we used to have on this piece of public sentiment has basically eroded and collapsed to the point where now more people feel like we're not doing that the right way. Here's a quote or two from what we heard in talking to people in these focus groups. If you've got enough money, you can get out of things. I feel like money is the common denominator when it shouldn't be. A couple of other quotes. If you find yourself in the American justice system, you want to find yourself a lawyer. And when you have a certain level of fame and fortune, things can go differently for you. So, Carl, this was, as I said, we heard an awful lot about this in the focus groups. Could you talk some more about how this sort of manifests and how people see the system working or not working for them?
Yeah, I think this was one of those findings where people talked about it not like an opinion, but like a fact. It was just such an obvious given to them. And they talked about bias and the two-tiered system of justice really along three lines. One, which was common to all of the groups, was wealth. The idea that, those who are wealthy can afford a level of representation and get a level of privilege back from the courts that other people do not get. That was an absolute given. That was a universal concept that was agreed upon across all of our groups. So wealth was number one, the most common and the most certain. Two was race. And as I said, we did groups with Black participants, we did groups with Hispanic participants, and we heard some in the other groups as well, but it was, again, it was an absolute certainty in those groups. And, when a focus group is going really well, people kind of play off of one another. It's like a good bar conversation, right? One person tells a story, and the next person jumps in, yeah, and they work with each other, and I don't have to talk because they're all talking. That's what happened when we talked about this, particularly in those groups. People all had stories. They all had personal, either things that happened to them or someone in their family that they shared and kind of built off one another. So wealth was number one. Race was number two. And then the third is this idea of political bias. And the politics kind of, I would kind of, had two spokes to it. One was those who are politically connected. Even if they're not wealthy, if they know the right people, they're going to get the same type of privilege that the wealthy are going to get from the court system. So that was one. The other was concern that judges are less and less open to the facts of the case and more coming in with a set of values, a set perspective that is immune to the facts of the case. And they worry about political bias in that respect, which is less about the participant and more about the judge. So the wealth, race, and political influence are all about the person going before the courts. The other piece was more about the judge behind the bench and what they're bringing to bear.
One of the things that really struck me, and these conversations really illuminated for me, is this idea that you're hearing from people in their own words about their own experiences, and it was incredibly visceral for a lot of people. I can say this because I've been doing work in this area for a long time. We love to talk about perceptions, right? That's a perception that people have, right? And that is our way of saying, okay, that's not really real because that's your perception. But that's kind of a convenient out. And what I felt like we heard a lot of was not people talking about their perceptions of things, but their real world lived experiences. Did you have the same takeaway from that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, it was, some people have had direct, we didn't make our groups exclusively people who had personal experiences in the courts. Just like, the larger population, we wanted it to be a mix. But what we heard was not just people who had personal experiences, but also relating the experiences of friends and family as if it was their own. Because absent their own experience, that was the most direct knowledge that they had. So even if it was secondhand or third hand, it still felt like fact to them. And that's important to understand, that's where they're coming from.
So in addition to the two systems of justice critique that we heard a lot about, we also heard people telling stories about, again, their personal experiences or experiences that have been related to them by friends and family members, about specific negative interactions that they had when they'd had some sort of dealing with the court. And we heard kind of a wide variety of these things expressed. I think what we face as a community is the reality that our level of customer service and delivering on kind of consumer needs is a challenge for a lot of people. And the way that I like to think about this is, you can go through life having lots of positive experiences, but you tend to not really remember those, right? You expect things to kind of go well, go smoothly. That's how life is supposed to be. But when you have a negative experience, that sort of thing tends to stick in the back of your mind, or in your craw, if you will. And the example that I used from my own life is, we were just talking about this before, I get to travel a lot for work, and I fly on Delta Airlines whenever I can, because you get some perks when you stick with the same airline. And I've flown a lot of miles on Delta over the years. And generally speaking, I'm happy with it. But the thing that I remember is the time that I got stuck. When they canceled my flight at 11 o'clock at night for no good reason. They told me it was weather. It wasn't weather, obviously. And I had to spend $400 on a hotel room to stay near the JFK airport, and I didn't get home after a long business trip. That's the thing that kind of like sticks in my mind as a frustration that I'll call up easily. And we heard a fair amount on this about how when people do have to deal with the court system, that it's a challenge for them. I love this quote here. They don't make it easy because they don't want you to figure it out, right? And what you hear in a sentiment like that is it's almost a conspiracy level type of thought, right? That these systems are designed to kind of further that two systems, where if you're on the inside, you're going to get what you need, and if you're on the outside, you really don't have much hope. Another woman told us, I get the process, but I don't understand why it takes so long. Maybe because I'm an outsider, but it seems like things could be processed a little bit better. So when people have had experiences, they've had a fair number of negative experiences, and these are things that do stick with people. Now, we talked exclusively to non-lawyers, and that was by design. And so, Carl, based on what you heard in this area, do you feel like this is a reasonable and fair critique?
Absolutely. One of the phrases that we test every year when we do the National Center for State Courts is intimidating. And I think it's one of the best words to describe how a lot of people feel and what we heard in the courts. The courts are intimidating. It's like this huge black box that people don't quite know how to crack. This woman, this quote right here, I'm an outsider. What does that mean? Like, she's an outsider of what, right? Like, the courts exist to serve the people who live within their jurisdiction, but she perceives herself as someone who doesn't belong there. And I think that just captures a lot of how people feel. Like there's some secret code, there's some secret language, a secret handshake, something that they don't know that would open up that other second tier of justice if they only knew, but they don't know what it is. There's a lot of a sense that people don't know what's back there, but they're sure that it's not working for them, and they're sure it's not designed for them. And that's the toughest thing. It creates this alienation.
So that gets us to, I think, our sort of final summation of what we heard a lot about from people with their concerns. This idea that courts are disconnected from their local communities. And why don't you elaborate a little bit on how this played out in these conversations?
Sure. So it goes back to, like I was saying, people don't understand how it works. And so they don't, if they were trying to make an argument to their friend or their neighbor, they would rely upon a certain level of thinking and they would assume a certain level of values and judgments. When they go into the courts, they don't assume that those things exist, even though the idea of, a jury trial or a judge from a local jurisdiction is that they reflect the values and the way of thinking of the local community, but people don't assume that about the courts. They assume that it's a completely different thing that is disconnected from their local communities, and that it doesn't share their values, it doesn't share their priorities, it doesn't share their understanding of the world and how it works, that there's a different set of rules. And so with absent a guidebook, absent some way to navigate it, and again, this kind of goes to customer service as well. When they do walk through those doors, what we heard over and over again was that they didn't feel like they were being seen as individuals. They felt like they were being treated as numbers. They felt like that people were looking through them and not understanding their personal concerns, their personal stake, and respecting them as an individual. And that, again, I think creates this sense of disconnect if that's how they view what happens once they walk through the courts of that doors of that courthouse.
So that's our, I think, fairly succinct summary of some of the problems that we heard. And, that was sort of half of the project. Half of the project was to understand why people feel the way that they do. And we gleaned, a great deal from that part of the conversation. But that wasn't all we wanted to do. We wanted to see if we could introduce new information that maybe people didn't know or hadn't thought about, and see whether or not there were persuasive things that we could tell them that would make them feel better. So we spent about, these focus groups were typically about 90 minutes. By the time we got to the last 30 minutes, Carl had them engaged in exercises where there were these new ideas were being introduced, and they were evaluating, saying, yeah, that makes me feel good. I like these words here, those sorts of exercises. That allowed us to look at all that information and pull together what we are describing as our health and wellness guide. And that's the subtitle of the booklet that you have in front of you, is the 4-step plan to put courts back on track to better public trust and confidence. So the analogy here, the health and wellness analogy, is something to give some thought to. Because, in your own life, if you decided that you wanted to make a big change, right? So maybe you decided that you didn't feel like you were very healthy, and it was time to do things differently. There'd be certain things that you would think about doing differently, and you might do one or two of them, but you need to actually do a whole set of things, and you need to be consistent and disciplined and follow through in all these areas to really make kind of radical transformative changes in your own personal health and wellness. And so our analogy here is basically that, which is if we're going to turn the tables on this conversation and go beyond civics education, we have to think about this in a different framework, and we have to approach this with a different set of strategies and messages. And that's what this guidebook is intended to do. So we tease out this health and wellness analogy through 4 steps, which are right here, and they include the sorts of things that you would do in your own life, right? Exercise, eating right, sleeping better, and taking vitamins or supplements. And if you do all those things and you do them consistently and you do them coordinated, there's a good chance that you're going to reach your goal of feeling better, of looking better, whatever it might be. So here's how we break this down in terms of the work that we do together. So the first is exercise. The exercise component is what we describe as the heavy lift. What people don't know is how much work state and local courts do. They have no idea. They really, really don't. And we heard this over and over and over again. And so when we would tell people that 95% of all the cases in America are filed in state and local courts, light bulbs went on. Because what do they hear about? They hear about the US Supreme Court, or they hear about the federal courts in the newspaper, or they hear about a single high-profile trial in their community. So we need to do a better job of telling people directly how much work is happening in the state and local courts and who is doing it, because it's being done by people in their local communities, by their friends, by their neighbors, by their family members. These are the people who work in state and local courts. So that's the sort of first key step, is to introduce the idea that so much of this work is being done right in your backyard. The courthouse that is maybe 2 miles from where you live, that's where the heavy lifting in the American justice system is happening. These are the sorts of things that we think that you can provide as examples, and that's the purpose of the guidebook, is to take some concrete messaging takeaways that you can implement in your communications and community outreach plans. So the second step is what we call eating right? And here we have an acronym, EAT, E-A-T, ethics, accountability, and transparency. This is maybe the thing that when you're trying to improve your health, you're going to go through a period of discomfort, right? It doesn't feel good to do things differently than the way you've always done them. And this, to me, is the discomfort, because we love to talk about things like judicial independence. We love to talk about how the courts are a separate branch of government. These are things that make us feel good about the work that we do. They make us feel important. The bad news is people don't care. It does not resonate with them. And what they do want to hear about is how courts are the most accountable and transparent branch of government, and how there are codes of ethics that the judges abide by and that court staff abide by. And if we lean into this messaging around ethics, accountability, and transparency, I can't tell you the reactions that we got from people who don't know that these things exist or are in place, because we have never really talked about them. So this is from our 2023 State of the State Courts Public Opinion Survey, where we asked people to tell us whether particular statements were convincing. In this statement on the left, state court judges must publish a legal explanation of the reasoning behind the decisions they make, and their decisions can be appealed to a higher court for review. Those are two basic pieces of accountability that exist in our system. And if we tell people about that, as the 73% figure indicates, people find that persuasive and convincing. They just don't really think about it, and they don't really know about it. So it's kind of our job to tell them. We did talk a bit about the codes of ethics, and I think you sort of brought it up in the context of what was happening in 2023 around the US Supreme Court, where there had been certain members of that court who had appeared on the front page of papers for a variety of things that they did and didn't disclose. Carl, what was your takeaway from talking to people about ethics and accountability and transparency in these focus groups?
So a couple of things. First, I think you can't overstate the importance of the Supreme Court as the only court that most people hear about on anything approaching a regular basis. And to the point of the message that's there, their decisions can't be appealed, right? Their decisions are just fiat and law. And then all the ethics and the controversies that Jesse talked about that were happening at the same time, there's a sense that there's just no accountability there. And so they assume that applies to lower courts that they don't hear about as well. So just educating them and letting them know that that's not the case, that the Supreme Court is actually the anomaly, it's not the rule, it's the exception, I think was just very reassuring to them. And again, it's a level of nuance and a level of detail they don't understand unless somebody tells them. And it was very important to them just to understand that there's some guardrails out there. They don't need to understand exactly, what the enforcement mechanism is for the Ethics Council and state by state. They don't care. They just want to know that there's guardrails and that there's somebody watching out, and that these people aren't all powerful and high on their own supply, if you will. That's what matters to them. And so letting them know that there's some guardrails there, letting them know there are rules of the road, even if they don't know exactly what they are, means a lot to them and helps go a long way in reassuring.
I think one person told us everybody does a better job when they're held accountable.
Yeah.
Right. That's how people see this issue. Here's what one person told us, she told us that it shows there are additional checks and balances. I think that makes me more confident. There are strict codes and processes in place to remove somebody who might not be making decisions for the right reasons. I pulled this quote out because it includes the phrase, I think that makes me more confident. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here, right? We're trying to increase confidence. So when people learn about these things, learn about ethics codes, it makes them more confident. And that means that we need to do a better job of making sure people know that they are in place. So let's get to the third step in our four-step program here. And here we're sort of flipping the analogy around where we're encouraging you to not sleep on the court's work as a community problem solver. And to get into a little bit of detail on this, what we discovered was that most people really don't, again, know much about how courts function as kind of like the first line of defense on all of society's problems. People are fundamentally angry with or disconnected from government in the big picture because they don't see government solving people's problems. They don't see government taking on the challenges that affect them in their everyday lives. And if you look at some of the polling that happened around the election, you may have seen information in these national surveys that really suggested a level of anger and resentment at government that was working for itself and not working for people in state and local communities. So as we added information to these conversations, did you know that courts in this state, depending on where we were, we provide some local examples, that they do these sorts of things, whether you want to call them problem-solving courts or other programs or projects. And there are a myriad of these sorts of programs that are run around the country in state and local courts. People generally didn't know, but when they learned about it, it was very impactful, and they felt much more enthusiastic and supportive. So our encouragement here is to, if you have these, make some waves with them, make them better known, focus on these sorts of programs, and there are lots of different ways you can talk about these problem-solving courts, for lack of a better expression. We did some message testing in our most recent survey where we wanted to see whether there was a difference in whether people were favorable towards these courts when we described them as drug courts or whether we described them as accountability courts. Because depending on where you sit, you might say, well, drug courts, that sounds like you're letting them off easy. But if we call them accountability courts, you might be doing the same thing, but it sounds different or somehow better. And the research that we did last year discovered basically that there actually isn't really any difference between those two words when you're describing what the system is. So the point here is think about what might work in your local area, something that might resonate, something that you do or that you could do, and try to spread accurate information about who is accessing these programs, what it does for the community, how it is helping solve people's everyday problems.
I think it's really important to connect what's happening. When people think about government, two things they think about. One, government is self-serving, not representing the needs of the communities it's supposed to serve. So this is a clear refutation of that idea. But also they think of government as very inflexible. It's like the Titanic trying to steer it. So if you can demonstrate that it's actually nimble, that the courts are actually nimble at responding to perceived problems within the community, talking about these things in connection, right? Homelessness is a rising issue in this community, and that's why the eviction diversion programs will help keep people in their homes. Opioid addiction is a growing problem in this community, and that's why drug courts are trying to keep people, get people the treatment they need rather than sending them to the prison system. Connecting them, showing that you understand what the problems are in the local community, and then talking about the solution really helps, create that cognitive distance and say, oh, this isn't like government. This isn't all the negatives that I assume. This is different.
I think it also really helped people understand that the problems that exist in different communities can be handled in different ways. And it sort of created a sense of flexibility within government. And a number of people commented on that sort of idea, right? That what would work in like Brooklyn and New York City is not going to be the program that's going to work in like rural Utah. But they see that as part of the power of state and local government and state and local courts. You can tailor something to your local community, right?
Yeah. And an age-old truism in research on government is the closer it is to home, the more people have faith in it. They believe in city government more than or local, county, whatever it is. They have more faith in that than they do in the state legislature. They have more faith in that than they do in Congress. The further you get away from their local community, the less faith they have. So you want to ground yourself in local, not far away, right? You really want to ground yourself in the community and demonstrate that you're part of that.
So one person told us, I liked the separate dockets. It was more descriptive. I really liked everything. It ticked all the boxes that I believe in. So lots of positive sentiment around this area that we all do a lot of work in. We're at our fourth and final step in the health and wellness guide, which is the supplement part. And so just as you might turn to vitamins and supplements in your own life to help you feel better, here what we're encouraging you to do is to supplement your media coverage. And we're living in a moment in time where the people aren't learning a whole lot about the functions of government, certainly of courts, through everyday mainstream media. And we should not rely on the media to be doing the work that we need done to tell our stories. So this part of the guide is really to suggest that you need to look at how information is being disseminated from your court, where it's going. This slide shows you a little bit about how people are telling us that they consume information right now. And so we're still living in this kind of bifurcated world. We're in this sort of generational divide where we've got almost an equal number of people telling us that they're still watching the local news on their TV every night, as are telling us that they get most of their information from social media or from YouTube, right? So this is going to change over time, but at the moment we have a really fractured audience of people who are both consuming traditional media but also turning to new media. And so that's the takeaway here, I think, is to think about this and think about how your court is able to share information across these different audiences, across these different platforms, and to think creatively about how you might be able to do that better. You have any thoughts on how people can do this in courts?
I mean, this graphic makes clear it's not either or, it's and, right? It makes the job of communications people that much more difficult. But you also have to think about what is the content that works best for each of these different things, right? If you're bringing emotional support puppies into the courts for a day, that works for everything, right? TV news will eat that up. It shows great on social media. It's universal, right? The diversion programs, that's harder to get. It's harder to tell that story in the bite-sized pieces of social media. But if your employees are out in the community doing something, that's something that you can do over social media. It plays really well. Local news probably is going to cover it. So you have to think about, what are the different pieces that work best for each of these and kind of tailor to the medium.
So I think we've reached the end of our 4-step plan here and have gone over what we think the 4 components are. This is obviously in the main part of the guide. We tried to keep it quick and easy and hopefully somewhat memorable. We have a lot of work to do. We certainly can't continue to just use the strategies that we've used in the past. The world is changing, and as we learned through our research, when we are talking to them using fairly traditional messages, it's really not sticking with them. It's not where they are. Carl, any final takeaways on what you felt like you learned from all this discussion with regular people?
I think one of the biggest things that stuck with me was the customer service piece. And how much people felt, there were just small examples. They talked about jury service, and several people across all the focus groups talked about going for jury service, and it was kind of a pain, but they understood why it was important and it was fine. But then they got there and they were sitting there forever and no one communicated to them. And then somebody came in and they're like, oh, you guys weren't needed. You should have left hours ago. And no one talked to them, right? And it just made them feel like they weren't valued, they weren't seen, they weren't treated as individuals. So just little things like that that really make all the difference. That are not, it's not a super heavy lift, but it is hard. And so those little pieces mean so much to people. And again, those anecdotal stories then get told, over and over again to other people, and it becomes the facts for people who haven't been inside the courtroom. So I think the customer service piece, of everything really was what stood out to me from the focus groups.
I think for me, the one thing that really stuck the most was around the two systems of justice reactions that we got. And you probably won't be surprised to know that the example that came up over and over and over in this context was around traffic court, right? And how, which is a thing that almost everybody can relate to. If you look at the survey work we've done, an awful lot of people have been into court to handle a traffic matter. And we heard repeatedly that this was a great illustration of how if you had the right lawyer, if you had enough money to hire a lawyer, that the outcome that you were going to get was almost guaranteed to be different from the outcome that you would get if you did not have representation. And also ties back to that idea of sort of valuing people's time in particular, because as you know, in a lot of sort of cattle call dockets around traffic courts, you can go and sit there for 2 or 3 or 4 hours before your case is heard. So these are, I think, like really good examples, really concrete examples of what people are frustrated about. And these are also things that are like really, within our power to make changes on. For those of you who came to the session this morning, you heard me sort of pontificate about how there are all these things that are outside of our control, and there's very little that we can do to sort of direct how the U.S. Supreme Court is covered, or the decisions that they're going to make, or how people are going to share incorrect information on social media, and the list goes on and on and on of things that are out of our control. And that's fine, right? But there's not much we can do about that. The purpose of this sort of work was for us to understand what is inside our control. What are things that we could do differently and could do better that will hopefully instill an increased level of public trust. And so that's the purpose of this work. I think we're at the end. I think we have a couple of minutes left. We know we're at the very end of the conference. People have flights to catch and a winter storm to beat. But if there are any questions, we'd be glad to hear them right now. I see a hand in the very back of the room.
Have you seen any courts do this well? Any good examples?
When you say this, you mean implement this whole thing?
Yes, implement this.
Well, not yet, because this is pretty new. But I think you could look around to different courts in different parts of the country and identify some examples in each of these areas. I think about the incredible work that's gone on in Houston around eviction diversion, where that the court there has had a nationally recognized program around eviction diversion, and not only that, they have completely aligned that with their PR efforts to make sure that it's getting coverage on local news, getting coverage in the Houston Chronicle. So there are lots of examples, and what I would love to hear from folks in this room by the time we next get together this summer is if you are aware of other leading edge efforts that you think align with the sorts of recommendations that we have here, because we would like to build out the next phase in this, which would be model examples. I don't want to use the word pilots because those are overused. We're really looking for places where we know some of this work is happening. So we'd like to collect that information from all of you as you see it.
Can we do anything to separate ourselves from the federal courts that seem to be doing everything they possibly can to ruin the reputation of the judiciary?
I'm going to punt that one to you.
You can tell your own story, honestly. I think that's the biggest thing. People understand that the state courts are different but only if they're hearing something about the state courts. That was what we heard. People just hear nothing. They never think about it unless they have to go in there. It's something that they know exists, but they don't ever engage with it. So if they're hearing something, again, whether that's through social media, wherever they are, and we know that people, meeting them where they live is a lot harder to do now than it was a generation ago. But that's the biggest thing, is being able to get stories to them and give them an alternative narrative. Because I don't think, Gannett has maybe one 23-year-old working at most of their newspapers now and writing stories. It's very, very difficult to tell a story. The national news is still going to be told. It's going to be on cable. It's going to be everywhere. And so it's just fighting a very difficult fight to be heard in that environment.
Yes.
Is there anything that you've looked at or work on community outreach efforts by courts? So I'm with the municipal court, and my judges lately in the last few years have been very active in trying to get to community events. We're having license reinstatement events and warrant lifting events and different things. And we also have a designated community outreach coordinator who does some of those things. So she carries information from our self-help center and our drug courts and all that kinds of stuff. Is any of that work kind of built into your processes or
I think that's exactly what
recommendations?
we're suggesting there should be more of. Yeah, absolutely. So where those efforts exist, see if you can somehow find resources to do more of them, to convert it into storytelling and publicity. So yeah, that's right on mark.
We heard in focus groups people who knew judges personally, such and such judge, coached my nephew's baseball team, something like that. People who had personal interactions with judges thought about it very differently. And then another example that I've heard of a fair amount recently that I think more and more communities are doing are mobile units, where you bring court staff and court resources into neighborhoods. And go to a shopping center, go to some central gathering point in a community and bring the courts to them. That's another thing that people are doing.
Online, Cheryl Stone asked for a follow-up question. Do you have the public trust and confidence data by state?
Yeah, so that's well, I'll let you handle that. You're the data guy.
We don't. Essentially, the sample size is not large enough by state in order to break it out. So each state is representative. So if we're doing 1,000 nationally, that means we're doing like 6 people in Delaware. We can't look at that, and even a larger state like a Georgia or even a Texas, you're looking at maybe 200 people in Texas. So it's not large enough, unfortunately, to look at state by state. We can look at it regionally, but not state by state.
But Carl will be very happy to come in and do a poll for you in your state. Yeah.
And we have done that in a couple of states. So.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you all very much for your time and your attention. And I think we're at the end.